So this is a video about boundaries. This was another wake me up in the middle of the night with insights one. I think I wrote about 6 pages on it. Had some pretty big insights, different things I've learned all coming together and connecting the dots. And boundaries, when it comes to human boundaries, human to human relationships, had been really challenging for me for a long time, and I feel much more confident and competent in my skill around it now, and part of it has to do with the way that I've shifted my orientation to understanding it, and so I wanted to share that with you all. This is definitely a part 1 of at least 2 parts, maybe 3, maybe who knows how many. But I want to start with the definition, right? What is a boundary? When we're talking about human to human relationships. So take a moment, and you can pause this and just consider, how would you define boundary? And if you had to even visualize it somehow, and again, human to human relationship boundary, how would you define it? So take a moment, write it down, and then come back before I share how I define it, right? So what I noticed is that the way that I used to think of boundaries when I had a really difficult time with them is I thought about them at like a structure. So I had this sort of metaphor, image, sense of it in my mind and my spatial awareness as some structure that I was supposed to build up between myself and another person. And I was very resistant to doing that. And I think there's a lot of wisdom. Now I see, I'm like, there was a lot of wisdom in that resistance. So if we see ourselves as biological flow systems, which, right, that's what we are, we have these currents of flow, energy flow moving through us, thoughts that move through, emotions that move through, sensation, movement itself, these currents that are moving. When you introduce a structure that dams up the flow, that makes it a lot more difficult for that system to function, and it's inhibitory. And so it's like putting a boundary on yourself, right? So I can see now why I had a tough time with that. And there was a kind of nebulous boundaries, like we need them, but what are they, right? So I want to offer an alternative metaphorical, and yet it's not really metaphorical, it's actually very concrete in the body experience of what a boundary really is. Well, for me, and what I've found to be useful for me and other folks. And that is, back to my notes, so boundary is a territory. It is spatial in nature. It is ground and it is space. So the territory is made of 2 things, ground and space. So I'm going to write that down. Territory. Ground and space. So it's ground and space between different entities that have a relationship. Ground and space. So we could conceive it more like entity, right? Entity. There's some kind of ground between them, some kind of terrain which they could traverse, and there's also space between them. what is the nature of the ground? What's the distance? And what is the quality of the space? So that this might start to sound a little abstract, but think of a time when you've been in a room with somebody and like you get bad vibes, you know? You don't have to be that close to them sometimes, and you're like, there's a kind of like vibe there going on, and it's in the space. There's some kind of charged energy in the space between organisms. And for that, your relationship with that person, you might feel like you need a lot more space and a lot more ground to have it feel more neutral in some way. For someone else, they might be very, you really want to hug them and you're very close to them, and you could even feel like you're connected with them, and you can feel that closeness before they even reach you. And that has a very different quality of spatial energy. So we're looking at ground and what's the quality of the terrain and the space, and the distance and the quality of space. And between these biological entities, these flow systems, what are the currents, the energies coming through them? And a key piece of it is I'll get to that in a minute. Getting ahead of myself. So, what is it that allows a human boundary to really be supportive of each of those entities? And, we're making it simple by putting two, of course. We have more complex configurations. What is it that would make a quality of boundary be supportive of both of those entities, and of the whole? And my experience is that a boundary is holistically supportive and successful, we could say, when it allows for those relational elements to inhabit their full dimensionality without inhibiting the other or inhabiting the other. So those two pieces. So this entity can fully take up its spatial dimensionality, which means its length, its physical sense of length, its width, and its depth, without going beyond the bounds and actually inhabiting the other's ability to take up their, I'm doing this, width and length and depth. So, and again, it's like, that might sound abstract in some way, but it's actually the very most concrete thing we've got, because length, width, and depth is something that we can affect in ourselves. So if a boundary is feeling like challenging in some ways, you might notice in yourself what happens to your dimensionality. Do you start to shrink in the vertical plane, in your vertical dimensionality? Feel like, I don't have that sense of dignity. Do you start to shrink in your width, right? I have to be isolated and that kind of thing. Do you start to shrink in your, really see this. I know I'm on a flat screen here, but look, depth, right? You start to shrink your depth from the back and the support behind you all the way to the front. Do you start to shrink your depth? And what happens in the space between you and the other entity? Does it feel neutral? Does it feel charged? Do you need to take more distance physically, actually step back in order to create more spaciousness there, to allow for yourself to experience your full depth, let's say? So, that's one, and I've kind of identified two types of boundaries. One that I'm calling for now, inner boundaries and outer boundaries. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about inner boundaries, so that it isn't too long. So inner boundaries. Inner boundaries. Okay. So the inner boundary, there's a key emotion connected with both. Bring the light up on that. Key emotion connected with each of these boundaries. So the inner boundary, key emotion, really important, is disgust. Disgust. Yeah. Okay. So disgust is very key because it's the emotion that tells us what is me and what is not me. This is the me, this is not me. So I shared an example in the other video about when I tried some ice cream and then found this piece of rubber in it. And I had a little bit of that disgust feeling, which is really useful because if I didn't have any of it, if I didn't have that feeling or I didn't have if I wasn't in touch with it, I might have swallowed the rubber, right? And which I might have been okay, but if I did that all the time, I wouldn't be very okay. I would get sick, right? So disgust is the yuck. It's the yuck. And it's the discernment between me and not me. What can I actually take in? And what is the not me that needs to be rejected in a way? Not that I'm, not as a perception of that something's wrong with it, but just that it is not to inhabit this me. It is to inhabit the space over there, not the space in here. So the disgust really has a lot to do with what is inhabiting the self. I only want the self to inhabit the self. And it has a really important function, disgust, which is it keeps us from getting sick, right? It keeps us from ingesting something poisonous. So, and there's two elements. This is how I think of it. Two elements to emotions, the sensory side, the motor side. The sensory side, the signal, feeling the disgust, really experiencing the feeling of yuck. And then we have the motor side of emotions, emoting, allowing that emotion to move us, to power our movements. And so for that, it would be embodied rejection. Embodied rejection. And there's a few ways that can look. One, I'm kind of already doing it with my hand. There's spitting out. There's also with the leg. Can you see the leg? No. There's with the leg, there's a kick. There's an extension of the knee extends out. And so the arm and the leg both push. So feeling disgust and embodied rejection. So feel it. Feel it. Move it is embodied rejection. And, when I was trying to understand about boundaries, just looking at my notes here, nobody talked to me about this. I really conceptualized it as a wall. So what happens when disgust is unexpressed, when it's unexpressed? So there's kind of two ways I see it tend to go. Unexpressed disgust. Either we've got on the one hand this kind of similar to what I talked about in the video about the magic of threes. So the one consciousness of the experience of everything as undifferentiated. So there's not a differentiation between me inhabiting the self and the not me that gets to inhabit that space over there. There's this quality of merging with the environment. And so just experiencing everything as undifferentiated, and that in my experience led me to feeling sick a lot. And so that was kind of the negative side of it. The positive side, I guess I could say, is that that undifferentiated quality it taught me something about this experience of oneness, right? And so there's a way in which when people said, oh, you gotta have boundaries, I was like, there's something in me that knew, but I like the oneness. And that was resistant to the idea of losing that quality. And so that's what I was afraid of. And I remember in a training that I did where we were doing a no practice, and what I kept doing, even though I was taught very clearly that once I extend my hands out, then to keep them with the other person there, to keep them extended as I move forward, I kept collapsing the distance. That's what I was doing. And I didn't really understand the significance so much at the time. In terms of that distance, like I knew this is something important here, but it was so unconscious in me to collapse the distance and to not want them to inhabit a space further away from me, to actually be very used to another person inhabiting me. So it was a training. There was something that I actually physically trained and continue to be able to allow for that. And the good news is that what I experienced, what I found is that I don't have to lose the oneness quality, that in fact, allowing for that full expression to come through, and then it actually also allows the other person to be in their fullness and me to be in connection with them and experience the oneness in a even more authentic way. Yeah. So that's one. The other way that I see it go, so I'll just write that. So nebulous merging, we'll say. The other way that I see it go is when the person gets stuck. There's something that has been learned about that skill of the expression, but they get stuck on it because it doesn't get to go all the way. And when they get stuck on the embodied rejection, all they do is reject. And they have a difficult time taking in, which is the opposite of that nebulous. You're merging, you take everything in. So for that person or a group of people or nation state, that rejection that is stuck, that is always perceiving the other biological entity or entities as a whole, as a threat, as a poison, right? As a not me, it only is able to see it as a not me. It's stuck on that, hasn't allowed for it to go all the way to completion to say, oh, okay, it is not me in a way. And, right? And this expression is actually allowed to complete such that we can both embody our full dimensionality, that gets to be all that it is. I get to be all that I am. I don't have to inhabit their space, right? I don't have to not allow them to take up space. I can see their fullness and allow for it, not see it as a threat. What else do I want to say about that? It's like, this is so important. That ultimately, once that's fully expressed, we can see the connectedness between, in this relational quality between these entities, and the ultimate oneness with that form, without merging with it in form or contracting away from it. So, what do we call the second one? It's stuck on not me. Oh, stuck on rejection. Stuck on rejection. So this is kind of like stuck on taking in, and the other one is stuck on out, right? In, out, right? So both of them end up in, there's a flow inhibition there. It's like stuck on a certain switch. I got excited. What else did I want to say about that piece? Yeah, that's a big one. So you can start to see that I'm talking about this in human-to-human relationships, and I'm giving the example with the drawing of like one biological human entity and another. But when we start to look at that in group, right, dynamics in culture and nation state, you start to see how these patterns, and that's where I get like super excited. You start to see how the patterns replicate, and how working with our own tendencies, if we tend to go one of these directions, directly has an impact, because we make up the group, right? It's made up of us. So we can work with that at our micro level. That makes up the macro. Starts to change the game. So that's what we're doing. So that's it for now. That is a lot of what I wish I knew about boundaries. The key piece being working with the, if you find yourself more on this nebulous side, the nebulous quality merging, the practice really is to start to notice the space between self, me, and whatever the other biological entity, and to experience that spaciousness between you two, to experience the spaciousness in your own body, your length, your width, your depth. Notice what gets collapsed, and also notice that entity and allow for them to get to take up their full space in their way. So that's for the nebulous. For the second one, if you find that this piece kind of is stuck on the out rejecting, seeing everything as more like seeing things as threat, and I don't want to take it in, I tend to have the impulse to reject before even trying it or something like that. If you notice that tendency, you can tell I was in the first tendency, by the way I describe things. If you find yourself more in this one, that what's really supportive is to complete that cycle, and to physically, so it's similar, right? But it's to start to notice that you have the impulse to reject first, and to physically let yourself do it, before necessarily believing mentally that that's what you want to do, but just physically allow for the rejection. It's like, okay, I'm just going to actually let that energy move through me. And then start to notice, what's the yum? What is it that you want to take in, that you're willing, can you feel the spaciousness in yourself, that you're open to actually taking something in. So that's really the learning for that second version, that second tendency that tends to come out. Next time, part 2, I'll go into the outer boundary and the emotion that is connected with that one. And I'll just save it. We'll go for it when we get to it. All right, enjoy.